August 12th, 2004, Athens, Georgia. It began like any other night. 52-year-old counselor Maggie Ellison was last seen at the Kroger on Baxter Street. Her gentle smile captured on a grainy security camera as she paid for milk, bread, and a packet of tea. The next morning, her sister found the groceries still on the kitchen table, a cup of tea gone cold, and a newspaper on the sofa, marked with a single, rusty stain of blood. Within hours, Athens became a city of fear. A woman devoted to helping others had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only silence and a mystery that would haunt Georgia for nearly 2 decades. For 16 years, her case lay frozen in the archives, until one forgotten drop of blood whispered the truth no one was ready to hear. What really happened to Maggie Ellison that night? And how did a single trace of DNA finally unmask the killer who thought time would protect him? Before we begin this investigation, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? I want to know how far this story can travel. And if, where you live, there's a cold case that still keeps your community awake. Hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and join us as we bring light to the stories the world tried to forget. Athens, Georgia, August 2004. The heat in the city lingered into the evening, making even the shadows feel thick and heavy. On Baxter Street, beneath the buzzing neon lights of the Kroger sign, Margaret Maggie Ellison moved with the practiced calm of someone used to carrying burdens that weren't her own. She was 52, a mental health counselor at the Oconee Community Center, well known to the troubled souls of Athens. She had the kind of presence that drew confessions from strangers in grocery store aisles, and the kind of patience that made people think hope was not so far away. That night, August 12th, the store's security footage captured her last moments in public. The grainy film showed Maggie's gentle smile as she waited in line, her hand cradling a small paper bag. Milk, bread, a packet of tea. Ordinary things. She thanked the cashier, left a few coins in the tip jar, and disappeared through the automatic doors. Outside, a late summer breeze barely disturbed the leaves. Maggie crossed the parking lot, unlocked her old Toyota, and drove away toward Maplewood Court, the apartment complex where she lived alone. There was nothing unusual about the evening, nothing that would have drawn attention, except that this would be the last time anyone saw Maggie Ellison alive. The next morning, her sister Linda Parker arrived just after sunrise. Linda's routine was to call Maggie at 7:15 every day, a ritual that had lasted for decades. But on August 13th, her call went unanswered. No matter how many times she tried, there was only the mechanical voice of the answering machine. Concern gave way to unease, and then dread. Linda got into her car, her hands trembling on the wheel, and drove across town. When she reached Maggie's apartment, Linda noticed the details first. The front door slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness leaking into the hallway, the porch light still on, though the sun was already up. She pushed inside, calling out. There was no answer, only the low hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock. The groceries Maggie had bought were neatly set on the kitchen table, untouched, the receipt still tucked beneath a carton of milk. A single cup of tea sat cold, a ring of condensation left on the wood. Every surface in the apartment was undisturbed, as if Maggie had simply stepped out for a moment. Linda's voice echoed in the silence. On the sofa, a newspaper lay crumpled, an old issue of the Athens Banner-Herald, folded open to the crime section. On one corner, barely visible, a small, rusty stain had spread across the headline. It was blood. The fear Linda had been trying to ignore now turned to certainty. She called 911, her voice steady but distant, already processing the loss even before the police arrived. Officers from Athens, Clark County responded within minutes, sealing off the apartment. The lead detective noted there were no signs of forced entry. The windows were locked, and nothing appeared to be stolen. The only thing out of place was a kitchen chair, nudged askew as if someone had stood up in a hurry. The cold cup of tea, the untouched groceries, the stained newspaper. These became the first clues in a case that would confound investigators for years. Outside, word spread quickly among neighbors. Maggie was well liked in the complex. She was the one people called when things fell apart. The little acts of kindness she'd performed for years, a home-cooked meal for a grieving widow, a ride to the hospital for a sick child, came flooding back in whispered conversations over chain-link fences. But no one had seen or heard anything that night. The hallway security cameras had been broken for weeks, and the only evidence was the footage from Kroger, already playing in a constant loop on the news. As the day wore on, reporters began to circle. "The woman who healed others has vanished into silence," read one local headline. Linda, her face pale and hollow-eyed, stood outside the apartment and pleaded for help. Police searched the surrounding woods, combed through dumpsters, and questioned everyone in the building. The answers did not come. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, the weight of uncertainty settled over Athens. At the community center, Maggie's clients gathered in the parking lot, sharing stories, holding on to hope. They pinned missing person flyers to telephone poles and taped her photograph to storefront windows. Yet beneath all the noise and activity, a sense of cold finality lingered. The details of Maggie's life were ordinary, unremarkable, until the moment they weren't. That night, the lights in her apartment stayed on, casting long shadows across the empty rooms. The groceries remained untouched on the table, the newspaper with its single dark stain lying where it had fallen. In a city full of people, one woman had disappeared without a trace, leaving only questions behind. Police worked quickly in the first hours after Maggie Ellison was reported missing. The crime scene at Maplewood Court was methodically cordoned off. Yellow tape stretched across the front steps. Officers stationed at every entrance. Neighbors peered through blinds as the flashing blue lights flickered against stucco walls, casting nervous shapes in the pre-dawn gloom. Detective Stephen Briggs, a man known for his stoic manner and methodical habits, arrived at 7:48 a.m., clipboard in hand, eyes already searching for invisible patterns. Inside, the apartment felt suspended in time. Each object remained exactly where Maggie had left it, as if she might walk back in at any moment. Yet beneath the ordinary, something was wrong. Profoundly so. Briggs started in the kitchen, pausing over the grocery bag on the table. Milk warming in the morning air, bread beginning to stale, tea leaves swelling inside the bag. Each item marked the precise hour Maggie's life was interrupted. He studied the cup of tea, its surface undisturbed, the faint outline left on the table. The chair, slightly moved from its place, suggested a sudden interruption. The light over the sink still burned. On the sofa, that same crumpled newspaper stared up at him, the small, rust-colored stain now an unyielding clue. Technicians dusted for fingerprints, photographed every angle, and collected fibers and hair from the living room rug. They worked silently, the only sounds the snap of gloves and the muted click of cameras. No sign of forced entry. The locks were intact, the chain still dangling from the door. Drawers were closed, jewelry untouched. Maggie's wallet and phone right where she'd left them. The only physical evidence, a small amount of blood and the slight displacement of a chair. As word of Maggie's disappearance reached local media, panic and speculation rippled through Athens. The story dominated the front page. Community counselor missing, no clues, no answers. People called the police with tips, most of them dead ends. a jogger who saw a car idling on the street, a delivery driver who noticed nothing unusual. No one recalled a struggle, a scream, or even a stranger in the hallway. DNA samples were taken from the blood-stained newspaper and sent to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. But in 2004, forensic technology was far less advanced. Weeks would pass before any hope of results, and even then, the odds of a match were slim. Detectives interviewed everyone who had been in contact with Maggie in the last 48 hours. Friends, colleagues, patients. No one stood out. No threats, no enemies, no history of violence. The only oddity was the absence itself, the gap Maggie left in her routine, the emptiness that trailed in her wake. Athens was a city small enough to feel personal. People talked. Secrets rarely lasted, but in this case silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Each day that passed without news, hope slipped further away. Detectives canvassed the apartment complex, knocking on doors, retracing Maggie's steps. They reconstructed her last evening. She left the Oconee Community Center at 6:42 p.m., stopped at Kroger, arrived home before dark. After that, nothing. It was as if the world had swallowed her whole. On the edge of town, the Oconee River drifted by, slow and muddy, indifferent to the crisis unfolding nearby. Search teams swept its banks, volunteers combed the woods, and helicopters circled above. Still, Maggie's name echoed only in unanswered questions. The evidence pointed nowhere. No forced entry, no robbery, no apparent motive. A woman vanished from her own home, leaving only a single trace of blood behind. As days stretched into weeks, the narrative of the case began to harden. Not a story of violence or chaos, but of absence, of life interrupted. Police filled out their reports, boxed up the evidence, and waited for the world to move on. But for Maggie's family, and for those she'd helped over the years, the loss was immediate and unending. The city felt smaller now, darker, the air charged with the memory of what had happened in those silent rooms. People still gathered at the community center, clinging to any scrap of information. But as the summer ended, Athens braced itself for a truth it did not want to name. Some mysteries grow colder with each passing day. The disappearance of Maggie Ellison quickly became the subject of anxious speculation and fear across Athens. In the first days after the crime scene was processed, detectives pressed forward with old-fashioned legwork, combing through interviews and tips, determined to pry some sliver of truth from the silence. Every witness was a potential lifeline. Detective Briggs started with the neighbors at Maplewood Court. The walls were thin in the old apartment complex. Most residents lived with an ear to their surroundings. A handful recalled the routine sounds of Maggie's evening, a door closing, the soft whir of the television, the faint clink of teacups. But one neighbor, an elderly woman 2 doors down, remembered something different. A thud, sharp and sudden, around 8 o'clock. She had paused, heart pounding, listening for an argument or a cry. But the building had fallen silent again within seconds. A man on the floor below had heard hurried footsteps on the stairs not long after. He peered through his window and glimpsed a figure moving quickly down the path, carrying a dark bag. The face was a blur, lost to the poor light. Police took statements, their notepads filling with names and times, descriptions vague and often contradictory. They checked security cameras on the street. Most were broken or angled away. There were no clear images of anyone entering or leaving Maggie's apartment that night. In a matter of hours, the precious window for catching a suspect in the act had already closed. Detectives began to turn over every stone in Maggie's life, searching for someone with a reason to harm her. The first name to surface was Eddie Malone. His file was thin but troubling. A former patient with a history of volatile outbursts, recently denied further treatment after a series of threats to staff at the community center. Maggie's colleagues remembered her fear after one incident, the kind she rarely let show. Eddie had been asked to leave the building, and Maggie, always direct, had been the one to tell him. Eddie was quickly tracked down, brought in for questioning. His hands trembled as he spoke, denying any involvement, his voice growing frantic as the night wore on. He told detectives he'd been working the late shift at a restaurant near the highway, a claim that, when checked, proved ironclad. Surveillance cameras, clock-in logs, and co-workers all confirmed his story. For a moment, hope flickered. The case would break open. But the lead dissolved, leaving only disappointment in its wake. More names followed. Friends, acquaintances, former clients. Some had struggled with addiction, others with rage. Each was scrutinized, their alibis checked and rechecked. Nothing fit. No one stood out as a credible suspect. Those closest to Maggie described her as unfailingly kind, but they also knew she dealt with people in pain. People who sometimes lashed out, whose desperation could curdle into something darker. Yet, every promising thread unraveled. There were no phone calls, no threatening letters, no evidence of a stalker. If anyone had been watching Maggie, they left no trace. Meanwhile, Athens itself began to feel the pressure. The community center's waiting room filled with anxious faces. Staff met behind closed doors, fearful that whatever had happened to Maggie might happen again. At night, residents of Maplewood Court double-locked their doors and left porch lights burning. A sense of unease seeped into the rhythms of daily life. Detectives returned to the original clues: the cold cup of tea, the grocery bag, the displaced chair. They reviewed the timeline again and again. Somewhere, they hoped, was the key to everything. A detail they'd overlooked, a pattern not yet recognized. But days slipped into weeks, and the evidence refused to yield its meaning. The story of Maggie Ellison began to fade from the headlines, replaced by fresher tragedies and newer scandals. But for her sister Linda, and for those who had counted on Maggie's guidance, the silence was excruciating. Linda made daily calls to the detective's office, her voice growing thinner with every message left unanswered. She posted flyers on lampposts, handed out photos at grocery stores, clung to routines in a world that felt newly dangerous. In the police station's evidence room, the blood-stained newspaper sat in a sealed bag, its secret locked away by the limits of the era's science. The cup of tea, the fingerprints on the kitchen table, the faintest trace of blood. They became the fragments of a case growing colder by the day. Detectives gathered in conference rooms, debating theories, mapping out the few facts they possessed. But as summer gave way to fall, the trail simply vanished. What remained was the absence itself, a life uprooted, a story unresolved, and a city left waiting for a truth that seemed determined to stay hidden. Weeks slipped by with agonizing slowness. The search for Maggie Ellison, once a consuming fire, dwindled to embers in the quiet routines of Athens. August bled into September, then October, and still her apartment at Maplewood Court remained empty. The scent of her perfume faded from the rooms, replaced by the neutral sterility of dust and disuse. The local news moved on. Where once Maggie's photo had watched over every grocery store and gas station, the flyers curled at the edges, faded by rain and sun, torn down by wind or indifference. Linda Parker would not let her sister's memory vanish. Each morning, she drove to Maplewood Court, parked in the same space Maggie used to claim, and sat in her car, staring at the door that would never open again. She phoned the detective's office daily, her messages growing quieter, less hopeful. Linda printed new flyers as the old ones disappeared. She paid out of her own pocket to keep Maggie's face in the public eye, making her way through the city with a staple gun and a stack of hope. At night, her home became a clutter of maps, lists, and marked calendars, each note a small resistance to forgetting. But hope is fragile when weighed against the machinery of time. The city's pulse did not slow. People got on with their lives. Rumors withered. The tips stopped coming in. At the Oconee Community Center, a framed photo of Maggie was set on the front desk. But even here, her absence became something people learned to live with. Her office, preserved at first as a kind of shrine, was eventually cleared for another counselor. Files were boxed, her mugs and plants quietly removed. Clients still asked for her, at first, then less often. Detective Briggs and his team pressed forward as best they could, driven as much by duty as by any real expectation of resolution. They re-interviewed neighbors, re-examined the physical evidence, and chased down the last few leads. Each came to nothing. The city's attention flickered elsewhere, then faded entirely. The days grew shorter, and with them, the certainty that anything would break the case. By late November, the official investigation wound down. The case file thickened with paperwork, but the heart of it, the vanished counselor, the blood-stained newspaper, the perfectly ordinary apartment frozen in time, remained unchanged. On a gray morning, Briggs stood in the evidence room, staring at the neat row of boxes. He lingered on the label, Ellison M., missing person. It felt like a betrayal, even though he'd done everything he could. The file was set on a shelf reserved for cold cases, tucked between dozens of others, all marked by the same quiet resignation. Linda's search became lonelier as winter pressed in. She refused to accept the unspoken verdict that the world offered, that Maggie was gone, that closure would never come, that eventually even grief would become a habit. She spent long hours online, combing through missing persons forums, reaching out to anyone who would listen. Most nights, she slept fitfully, kept awake by dreams of her sister in places both familiar and strange, lost in the woods, wandering through the city, reaching out from behind locked doors. By the time spring came to Athens, the story of Maggie Ellison was receding into the city's background noise. In 2008, 4 years after her disappearance, the Athens Clarke County Police Department formally closed the active investigation. The file was boxed up, assigned a new number, and entered into a system where unresolved tragedies were measured not by urgency, but by the weight of their silence. What remained was the trace evidence. The blood on the newspaper, carefully preserved in a laboratory freezer, was all that science could offer. The report noted the stain was small, the sort of thing left by a cut finger or a nosebleed, but in this case it was the only tangible link to what had happened that night. Forensic technology in 2004 had limits. No match was found, and the DNA sat, unidentified and inert, waiting for an era that might offer answers. The rest of the evidence, fingerprints, carpet fibers, the cup of tea, were logged, cataloged, and set aside. Linda, too, grew quieter in her grief. There were anniversaries marked with silent vigils and small gatherings at the community center. Each August, she led a few friends down to the riverbank, candles flickering in the humid dark. Maggie's name whispered among the insects. But as years dragged on, the circle of memory shrank. New faces moved into Maggie's old apartment. Neighbors forgot the story, or confused it with other tragedies. The city itself stopped asking questions, and so Athens moved on. Children grew up, buildings were remodeled, the seasons cycled through. The only things left unchanged were the evidence boxes, a single dark stain, and the quiet ache of a sister who refused to stop hoping. For Maggie Ellison, there was no ending, only a pause, an echo, and the slow erasure that follows when the world decides to forget. 16 years passed. The city of Athens changed, reshaped by new buildings and new people. But in the police archives, dust gathered quietly on the cold case files. Among them, a box with the name Margaret Ellison scrawled across faded cardboard. It sat untouched for years, a silent record of a loss that most had already learned to accept. In the spring of 2020, a shifting of assignments in the Athens Clarke County Police Department brought Detective Daniel Reed to the cold case unit. Reed was young for a detective, meticulous and newly promoted. His first days were spent with his head buried in old files, learning the city's unfinished stories by the brittle weight of their paper. On a rainy afternoon in March, he pulled the Ellison file from the shelf, drawn by the simple, unresolved facts. A woman missing, no suspect, one small stain of blood. Reed laid the evidence out in the small cold case office, the desk illuminated by a tired fluorescent bulb. He read every report, reconstructing the final day of Maggie's life. Her work at the community center, her stop at Kroger, her return to Maplewood Court, the untouched groceries, the cup of tea cooling into silence. He lingered on the description of the blood-stained newspaper, carefully bagged and labeled, preserved all these years. Most of the evidence felt like echoes, blurred by time. But the blood was different. It was tangible, a piece of that night frozen for decades, still waiting for its meaning to be uncovered. In the years since Maggie disappeared, forensics had been transformed. Reed thought about cases he'd seen solved with technologies that had been science fiction when the Ellison case first went cold. DNA analysis, once slow and uncertain, had become precise and near omniscient. New national databases connected crimes across states, across years. Genetic genealogy, using family tree mapping and open-source databases, had cracked open cases older and colder than Maggie's. Reed found the contact information for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. He filled out the paperwork, double-checked the chain of custody on the blood sample, and arranged for its transfer to Atlanta. The envelope, when it left the office, was just another slip in the day's paperwork. But Reed felt the air shift as it left his hands, as if some current had been reawakened. While waiting for results, Reed tracked down the handful of witnesses still living in Athens. He met with Linda Parker, now grayer and slower, her grief weathered into quiet dignity. She was surprised by his call, surprised anyone remembered her sister. In her small kitchen, she poured coffee and told the story again, every detail still sharp, her faith never fully extinguished. Reed listened without interruption, making careful notes, feeling the burden of years in every pause. The forensic results came back faster than expected. In May, a call from the GBI interrupted Reed's morning routine. The voice on the line was excited, professional, but barely hiding its own sense of history. They'd run the old DNA sample through a series of new databases. Modern genealogy analysis had done what years of police work and hope could not. The DNA matched a living person. The match was conclusive. The blood on Maggie Ellison's newspaper belonged to Tyrone Hayes, a man already serving a sentence in a Georgia state facility for an unrelated crime. The shock was less in the name. Hayes had not even appeared in the original investigation, than in the certainty. After so many years, an answer had appeared, as undeniable as gravity. Reed stared at the name on the report, thinking of Maggie's last moments, of the city that had gone quiet, of Linda Parker lighting candles by the riverbank year after year. He pulled Tyrone Hayes' file. The details were unremarkable. A life marked by petty theft, sporadic violence, a drifting existence around Athens in the early 2000s. Hayes had been a delivery driver, living just a few blocks from Maplewood Court. There were arrest records for theft, for trespassing, nothing that ever rose to the level of real attention. In the chaos of 2004, he had simply been another face, another anonymous thread in the city's fabric. But now, 16 years later, the science was irrefutable. Detective Reed closed the file, aware of the gravity of what had been uncovered, of how a tiny fragment of blood could speak when every voice had fallen silent. He prepared his report and called the district attorney's office. Outside, the spring rain pattered against the windows. For the first time in years, the story of Maggie Ellison was moving again, painfully but undeniably, toward the truth. Detective Reed sat alone in his office late into the night. The pages of Tyrone Hayes' life spread out across his desk. In the silence, he sifted through reports, old arrest records, faded mugshots, each document painting an incomplete portrait. Hayes was not the monster that people conjure in their fears. He was ordinary, unremarkable, a man living at the city's edge, slipping in and out of trouble without ever drawing much attention. But behind the scattered lines of his record, Reed sensed a pattern, faint but persistent. Hayes' life, like so many who orbit the margins, was marked by instability. He grew up moving from one foster home to another, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. His jobs came and went: busboy, delivery driver, warehouse laborer. In 2004, he lived in a cramped apartment only a few blocks from Maplewood Court. No close friends, no steady family, just a trail of acquaintances who remembered him as quiet, kept to himself. But there were gaps in his story, moments when anger and desperation cracked the surface. The police files revealed bursts of violence, always small: an argument with a supervisor that ended with thrown dishes, a petty theft from a gas station, a fight at a bus stop. Nothing ever amounted to real jail time. But the record hinted at a man with little control, someone whose fear could turn suddenly to rage. Reed reached out to a behavioral profiler for a formal assessment, searching for understanding in the pattern of broken days. The profiler's report arrived within the week. It was blunt, clinical, almost cold in its conclusions. Tyrone Hayes did not set out to kill. His criminal history was one of theft and impulse, not premeditation. But the report painted a scenario, one that fit with the evidence left behind in Maggie's silent apartment. Hayes had likely entered with the intention to steal, perhaps believing the unit was empty. When Maggie surprised him, fear and panic took over. The violence that followed was sudden, unplanned, catastrophic in its consequence. It explained the clean apartment, the absence of struggle, the lack of missing valuables. No long fight, no chaotic search for things to take. Just one moment, Maggie awake. A scream, a flurry of panic, a sharp movement, and then the aftermath. The cup of tea still cooling on the table, the groceries untouched, the faint smear of blood on newsprint. In the cold logic of forensic psychology, it was an act not of calculated evil, but of a life teetering on the edge, nudged into violence by fear. Reed followed the theory through the case files, looking for resonance. The time matched, the window when neighbors heard a thud, the sighting of a figure leaving with a dark bag. Hayes would have known the complex, known how to slip in and out unseen. His name had never surfaced because his presence had never drawn suspicion. The weight of the explanation was both a relief and a new sorrow. Reed imagined Maggie, the kindness that defined her life, confronting an intruder not with rage but perhaps with confusion or even calm. He thought of the countless people she had counseled, guided away from the brink, only to be met with violence by a stranger lost to his own panic. As Reed compiled his findings, he considered the aftermath for Hayes himself, a man whose violence had forced him to carry the memory of that night for 16 years, even as the world forgot. The profiler's report ended with a single, chilling line. In the absence of intention, there is only the chaos of fear and the devastation it leaves behind. Reed's summary went into the file, added to the evidence that now formed a tight, undeniable web. The cup of tea, the displaced chair, the blood, the silence. Every piece, once a mystery, now slotted into place. The case, so long marked by confusion and silence, had gained its first moment of clarity. Outside, Athens carried on, its streets washed by the rain, its people hurrying past the small markers of grief they no longer noticed. Inside the cold case office, Reed sat with the weight of new knowledge. The investigation was no longer about what had happened, but about why. And in that answer, there was no comfort, only the cold reality of loss and the thin line between ordinary life and tragedy. March 2021. The city had only just begun to shake free from the long shadow of winter when the Athens Clark County Police Department moved on Tyrone Hayes. The air was cold and wet. Early sunlight filtered through a shroud of low-gray clouds. Hayes was no longer a ghost drifting through the city's edges. Now he was inmate number 47209, living out a long sentence for a different crime in a Georgia state facility, time passing in slow, measured increments. Detective Reed arrived with a warrant in hand. Security at the facility was routine. Searches, metal detectors, the heavy finality of locked doors. In the bland, echoing corridors, Reed felt the tension build, the culmination of months of quiet investigation. He was joined by 2 officers from the state prison, both careful to keep their distance from the case's emotional weight. The room they used for the interview was sterile, a table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor, a window set high in the wall letting in a thin, indifferent light. Hayes was brought in, wrists cuffed, his expression unreadable. Time had not been kind to him. He looked older than his years, hair receding, shoulders slumped. There was nothing remarkable in his posture or his eyes. He could have been anyone, anywhere. But Reed saw more. The nervous tapping of a foot, the way Hayes's gaze flickered to the door, as if even now he might escape what waited in the past. The first hour was procedural. Reed explained the charges, laid out the facts with a measured detachment that left little room for argument. He slid the DNA results across the table, watched as Hayes stared at the paper, mouth tightening. For a long time there was silence, the weight of years pressing down on both men. Hayes denied knowing Maggie Ellison, denied ever being in her apartment, denied everything. His voice was steady, his denials practiced, the kind of rehearsed response that comes from long experience with interrogation rooms. But the evidence was a living presence in the room. The DNA on the newspaper, the timeline reconstructed, the statement of the neighbor who had seen a man carrying a dark bag, all of it circled Hayes like a silent jury. Reed kept his tone level, allowing the facts to build their own case. He knew the truth was a patient thing. He let the minutes pass, let the silence grow uncomfortable. Hours ticked by. Hayes's denials began to fray at the edges. Reed pressed with the details, the proximity of Hayes's old address, the gaps in his alibi, the patterns of violence in his record. The walls seemed to close in. Hayes's voice grew softer, less certain. He shifted in his chair, fingers picking at the seam of his prison uniform. The room felt colder, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The breaking point came after 8 hours, when the sun had long since faded, and the only light was the harsh fluorescence overhead. Reed pushed one last time with the witness statement and the forensic match. Hayes looked up, eyes red-rimmed, jaw clenched. The words, when they came, were barely more than a whisper. He spoke of money, how he had been desperate, out of work, convinced no one would be home. He described entering quietly, moving through the dark, startled by Maggie's sudden presence. The rest came in fragments. A shout, a flash of panic, the edge of a knife caught in reflected light. His account was disjointed, broken by shame and years of repression. Hayes admitted to dragging Maggie's body from the apartment, wrapping her in an old blanket, and carrying her through the complex under the cover of darkness. He confessed to leaving her near the Oconee River, in a wooded patch behind an abandoned construction site. He remembered the heaviness of the ground, the silence of the trees, the fear that never left him. When Reed stood, the confession recorded and signed, the case felt less triumphant than tragic. There was no sense of victory, only a profound exhaustion, as if the years of grief and uncertainty had finally crystallized into a single, undeniable truth. The truth was plain, stripped of motive or drama. A desperate man, a sudden encounter. A life ended in the space between fear and violence. The police moved quickly after the confession. Search teams were organized, forensic experts called in. The area near the Oconee River sealed off and mapped. Linda Parker was informed in person, her reaction subdued, as if part of her had always known how the story would end. Athens, for a moment, paused, its familiar routines stilled by the weight of an old secret coming to light. The sun set on March 19, 2021, over a city changed by what it had finally learned. Maggie's absence, once a lingering question, was now an indelible fact. The machinery of justice began its slow, grinding motion. But in the quiet after the arrest, there was only the sound of rain against glass and the knowledge that even the coldest cases can be thawed by the persistence of truth. May 2021 brought early heat to Athens, the kind that lingered into the evening and made the air hum with insects. It was the season when the city's green edges thickened, when undergrowth swallowed empty lots and old construction sites. On the outskirts, off Lexington Road, a patch of overgrown land lay forgotten, marked by weeds, scattered debris, and the faint outlines of what once was a promise of new homes, now overtaken by wildness. This was where the search began. Detective Reed and a team of forensic experts arrived at dawn, their vehicles lining the edge of the property. Police tape fluttered in the muggy breeze, drawing a pale yellow line between the world of the living and the hidden past. The ground was soft beneath their boots, the grass wet from overnight rain. each step muffled as if even nature wished to hush what was about to be revealed. The confession had been clear. Tyrone Hayes had described the place in halting fragments: a grove of trees behind the old concrete pillars, a dip in the land near the riverbank, a patch where the soil was looser, darker, marked by a half-buried cinder block. Reed led the search, working methodically, walking the lines again and again. Forensic specialists used ground-penetrating radar, marking subtle shifts in the soil. Dogs trained to detect the scent of death moved through the brush, pausing and circling, then moving on. It was slow work. The team sifted through layers of leaves, roots, and discarded trash, broken bottles, plastic bags, the decaying husk of a child's toy. Hours slipped past. The sun climbed higher, pressing sweat from every brow. Onlookers gathered at a distance, their faces grave, old rumors and fears now brought into the harsh clarity of daylight. Mid-afternoon, the call came. A technician's quiet voice over the radio, the tone unmistakable. A patch of ground near the old construction boundary had yielded something unusual: compacted earth, the color wrong for the season. Carefully, the team began to dig, peeling back the layers with gloved hands and flat-edged shovels. Inch by inch, the past came back to the surface. Beneath less than 2 feet of soil, the first bone appeared. Human remains, pale against the darkness of earth, arranged in a silence that needed no translation. The digging slowed. Evidence markers were set down. Forensic photographers documented every angle, preserving the story as it emerged. Nearby, something glinted, a thin chain tangled with soil. When brushed clean, it revealed a small silver necklace, its pendant engraved with the initials M.E. The weight of that discovery hung heavy in the humid air. Reed stepped back, letting the forensics team work. Each piece of evidence was cataloged, bagged, and labeled. DNA samples would be rushed to the lab, but already there was no real doubt. The necklace was unmistakable. Linda Parker herself had provided an old photo of Maggie wearing it just weeks before she vanished. News of the discovery spread quickly. By the evening, the site was awash in reporters, their cameras struggling to capture the gravity of a scene that could not be made whole by any headline. Neighbors from Maplewood Court came and stood at the edge of the tape, some weeping quietly, others silent, their thoughts turned inward. Linda was notified in person, brought to the scene not for confirmation, but for closure. She stood a distance from the excavation, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed not on the cameras or the faces of officials, but on the narrow, broken ground. When the necklace was shown to her, she nodded, a soundless acceptance passing between her and Reed. She said little. Grief, after so many years, had become a companion that did not need words. The forensic analysis would later confirm what everyone already knew. The remains were Margaret Ellison's. The finality of that truth was both a relief and a fresh wound, opening again the ache of loss that had become so much a part of Linda's life. In the days that followed, arrangements were made for Maggie's burial. The community center held a memorial, candles on the riverbank, prayers offered in the humid dusk, memories shared in the gentle voices of those who owed her a piece of their own healing. For Athens, the silence that had haunted the city for so long finally broke, but it was not replaced by peace. Instead, there was a solemn reckoning, a recognition of all that had been lost and all that could never be recovered. The story was complete now, the questions answered, but the answers changed nothing about the cost. On the night after the discovery, Linda Parker sat in her living room, the necklace in her hand, the house silent except for the distant call of summer insects. "At least," she whispered, "I finally know where my sister is, but my heart will never stop waiting." The words hung in the air, a benediction for the living and the dead. The city moved on. Summer deepened. The crime scene was cleared, and the land grew wild again. But the truth, once buried, could not be hidden any longer. After 16 years, the quiet was broken not by vengeance or outrage, but by the slow, aching arrival of understanding. Athens remembered, if only for a moment, what it meant to lose someone twice, once to the darkness and once to the truth. October 2022. The courthouse in downtown Athens loomed gray and solemn, its marble steps worn by decades of footsteps. Witnesses, jurors, victims, and the accused all passing beneath the same high archways. On the morning of the trial, the air was thick with a sense of finality. Reporters waited outside, their breath visible in the autumn chill, microphones and notepads in hand. For the city, and for those who remembered Maggie Ellison, the day felt heavy with expectation and grief. Inside, the courtroom was packed but hushed. At the prosecution table, files were stacked in neat piles. Photographs of evidence, DNA results, the signed confession, and a worn photo of Maggie smiling with her sister, now creased from years of handling. Linda Parker sat in the gallery, her hands clasped tightly, her posture stiff with anticipation. The years of waiting had turned her grief into a kind of armor, each day preparing her for the moment when she might finally hear the truth spoken aloud. Tyrone Hayes entered in a prison uniform, flanked by 2 deputies. He looked smaller in the stark light, shoulders hunched, face set in lines of regret and fatigue. There were no outbursts, no drama, just the relentless gravity of consequence. The charges were read: voluntary manslaughter, with aggravating circumstances, the evidence overwhelming in its clarity. The room listened as the prosecution described the chain of events, how Maggie's life ended not out of premeditation, but out of fear and desperate impulse. The facts were laid bare. A woman who devoted her life to helping others, taken in an instant of chaos and panic. Witnesses took the stand: the detective who reopened the case, the forensic scientists who explained the DNA match, the behavioral profiler who painted a portrait of a man cornered by his own instability. There were no surprises, no last-minute revelations. The confession stood as the anchor of the prosecution, and Hayes, for his part, did not try to fight the evidence. He spoke only once, quietly, acknowledging his role, asking for forgiveness he did not expect to receive. The defense focused on the absence of intent, on the life that had led Hayes to the margins, a plea for mercy more than a denial of responsibility. The jury listened, their faces unreadable. The deliberations were brief. With the confession, the DNA evidence, and the witness testimony, the outcome felt inevitable. When the verdict was read, guilty of voluntary manslaughter, there was no outcry, no celebration. The sentence was pronounced: 40 years in a Georgia state facility. The judge's gavel fell with a dull finality, the echo marking the end of an 18-year ordeal. The weight of justice, so long delayed, finally settled into the bones of the courthouse. Linda was granted a moment to address the court. She spoke not just for herself, but for the sister she had lost and the city that had been left waiting in silence for so many years. Her voice trembled, but did not break. Justice came late, but at least it came. my sister can finally rest." Her words drifted through the chamber, filling the space between the living and the dead. Afterward, as the courtroom emptied, the sense of closure was complicated. For Linda, and for those who knew Maggie, the verdict was not a victory, but an ending, one that could never restore what was taken. Outside, autumn leaves skittered along the courthouse steps. Reporters filed their stories, the headlines capturing only the surface of what had transpired. Athens returned to its quiet rhythms. The Ellison case, once the city's most haunting mystery, now occupied a single line in the archives: solved, closed, concluded. But for those closest to it, the pain lingered, lessened only by the knowledge that truth, at last, had found its place. There was no triumph in the judgment, only the cold, slow movement of justice, a reckoning that left everyone changed. In the end, the final word belonged to silence. Maggie Ellison was not forgotten, not erased. Her story had been reclaimed from the dark, shaped into something that might, in time, become memory rather than wound. The city would move on, but beneath the surface, the currents of her life and loss would always run deep. In the quiet that followed the trial, Athens settled back into its familiar patterns. Streets bustling at rush hour, children biking along the river, shop windows lit against the evening. But beneath that routine, the story of Maggie Ellison left a mark not easily erased. Her name lingered in conversations, her photo tucked into a bulletin board at the Oconee Community Center, her absence still felt in the everyday lives she once touched. For the city, the resolution of her case was both an end and a beginning, an answer to a haunting silence, and a reminder of all the questions that will always remain. What happened to Maggie Ellison was, tragically, not unique. Her story was inspired by the real-life murder of Pamela Chrysler, a mental health counselor in Athens, whose own life ended in violence and mystery. Pamela, like Maggie, spent her days helping others heal, and like Maggie, her death left an emptiness in the world she tried to make better. It took 16 years and a revolution in forensic science to finally name her killer. The truth, long buried, rose to the surface because people refused to forget, and because science, at last, caught up with memory. For Linda Parker, the answers brought a certain peace, but not closure. She continued to live with the rhythms of grief, lighting a candle each year on the anniversary, tending the small memorial by the Oconee River. Athens, too, marked the loss in quiet ways. Each time a case went cold, detectives remembered the lessons of Maggie's file. Preserve everything. Pursue every trace, never assume silence means resolution. The case became a touchstone, not just for the police but for the community. It highlighted how easily kindness can be taken for granted, and how vulnerable even the strongest can be. It was a reminder that the world is sometimes most dangerous to those who open their doors, who offer help, who believe in the possibility of change. But it was also a testament to persistence, the slow, grinding patience of those who refuse to let the missing be forgotten, who hold space for the truth even when the world moves on. There were practical lessons, too. The investigation underscored the importance of sharing routines, especially for those living alone. It urged vigilance, the need to report even the smallest anomalies, a door left ajar, a cup of tea gone cold. It taught that every detail matters, and that science can be an ally in the search for justice, no matter how many years have passed. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson was simpler, more personal. It was the knowledge that memory itself is a kind of justice, the act of remembering, of refusing to let a name disappear into the silence. For Maggie, for Pamela, for all those whose stories risk being lost, memory is a kind of rescue, a bringing into the light. As the documentary closes, the camera lingers on the Oconee River, the slow water catching the last light of day. A narrator's voice echoes softly. There are wounds that only truth can heal. In honoring their stories, we honor the best in ourselves. Subscribe to our channel and join us in keeping their memories alive, in the endless search for justice that never sleeps. And with that, the city exhales. For a moment, the noise of the world quiets, making room for remembrance, for gratitude, for the fragile hope that comes from knowing even the coldest silences can one day be broken.